Hello and welcome once again to my Battle of Five Armies project vlog. In the last episode I was able to show off a large bulk of the good army, namely the Dwarves of the Iron Hills led by Dane and the Elves of Mirkwood led by the Elven King. These two proud races couldn't be less alike, the Dwarves being stocky, rugged and uncouth, and the Elves being tall, wise and graceful. And my experience of painting them turned out to be equally contrasting. I'd tackled the Dwarves first and found them a real joy to paint. A rich green for their large shields, a warm brass for their round helms, bright silver for their chainmail coats, and bold browns for their bushy beards and burly boots. I couldn't believe how quick they were to paint, and how good they looked on the tabletop. Something about the colour scheme just pops. For the first time in this project I felt like I achieved something pretty close to the pictures in the rulebook. It was only when I came to photograph them that I realised, probably as a result of the lack of time I'd spent on them, they weren't quite as neat as I'd have liked. I may go back and touch up some of the axe heads in particular, but honestly on the table you'd never notice at this scale. When it came to the elves, however, I must admit I was slightly daunted. Not only are they twice the size of the dwarves, in numbers I mean, not height, although that too, they just seemed a lot more fiddly to paint. The colour scheme in the rulebook looks incredible, but I wasn't at all confident in being able to replicate it myself. The mintish green blending out to an almost pure white certainly looks stunning, but I had no idea how to go about achieving anything like that with my crude painting style. Well, lucky for me, tucked away in the rulebook is a painting guide, which up to this point I'd mostly ignored. So what paints would I need to achieve this elegant scheme worthy of the beauty and grace of the immortal elves of Middle-earth? Let's take a look. Paint the skin dwarf flesh. Seems a bit counterintuitive, but okay. Then bubonic brown for the bows. Bubonic, like the disease. Goblin green for the cloaks, followed by a layer of rotting flesh. Vomit brown for the hair. Vomit brown. Come on now. Did a disgruntled dwarf come up with this? Imagine if Tolkien had written about elves the way Games Workshop name their paints. And proudly the elven host stood, their cloaks gently flapping in the breeze like rotting flesh, their bubonic bows in hand, and their hair glinting like vomit in the morning sun. Honestly, it's no wonder it took girls so long to get into this hobby. Anyway, after a few frustrating failed attempts at the aforementioned scheme, I instead found myself steering to something that's probably closer to the classic Warhammer Wood Elf archers from the 90s. And despite hating everything I was doing whilst painting them, I do now in hindsight think they turned out pretty well. Definitely less striking than the scheme in the rulebook, but perhaps in my defence, more fitting for Mirkwood elves. And despite having preferred the dwarves initially, I think the extra time I spent on the elves meant they looked a bit better in the photos. With the completion of the elves and dwarves and the men of Lake Town, which were shown off in the episode prior, the bulk of the good army was all but complete. All that remained left were to paint the eagles, Thorin and two of his kin, and Bilbo and Gandalf. Oh, and the ruins of Dale, which perhaps I should have done alongside the men of Lake Town, but oh well, here they are now. They're really nice, varied scenery pieces that do a lot to help visualise the 10mm scale. I am tempted to base them, but I need to check how the models interact with scenery in the game first, as I don't want to make them awkward to use. With that out of the way, I started work on the eagles, which I'll show off at the end of the video. Tolkien's fondness for eagles has always intrigued me, only in as much as we don't have them in England, and so much of his writing seems to have been inspired by the natural world around him. We do have several other equally majestic birds of prey, however, and particularly in my area we have red kites, which often circle the skies above my house. Around the time I was painting my eagles, I was able to catch this amazing encounter with a red kite on my phone. They've had a huge resurgence in population over the last decade, but I still always find them breathtaking to look at. England's wildlife is very meek, so for me witnessing a huge predator in the skies like this feels almost like seeing a mythical creature. When it came to painting my eagles, I took at least some inspiration from the markings of the red kite. Next up was Thorin, who in the rulebook is painted in the same scheme as the Dwarves of the Iron Hills. This didn't seem right to me, as Thorin's company are described in The Hobbit as having an array of different cloak and cap colours, and I wanted to represent that. When the dwarves first barge into Bag End, Thorin is described as having a sky blue cloak. I started with that and then used this painting by Michael Hague for further inspiration. Again, you'll see the result of that towards the end of this episode. And that just left one final piece of the puzzle. It seemed fitting to save this model until last, and I knew I wanted it to be something I was really proud of. And for the first time, I decided to film each step to show my process of painting at this scale, as it now feels like a culmination of everything I've learnt along the way. Once again, I decided to ignore the paint job in the rulebook, and instead found myself looking to some more of Michael Hague's art for inspiration. Inside this Tolkien's World art book, there are two perfect reference pieces. One of Bilbo in the Riddles of the Dark scene, and another of Gandalf being rescued by eagles in Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire. So, with that to hand, I picked out some colours and got to it. I started with Administratum Grey for Gandalf's robes. As you can see, I'm using a wet palette to thin the paint, and then it's just a case of trying to be as neat as I can, even at this early stage. Next is Eshin Grey for his cloak. Then a light up blue for his hat, which is probably a brighter blue than you would choose in 28mm, but in 10mm I've learned that strong contrasting colours look much better, and especially as Gandalf is mostly grey, this should give him a nice pop. Next is Wazdaka Red, which I'm using for Bilbo's tunic. With Gorthor Brown I then painted the bird, which I assumed was supposed to be a thrush, as they pop up in and play a crucial role in the story of the Hobbit, acting as messengers to the forces of good. I then used Dryad Bark for Gandalf's staff. I then used Elysian Green to paint what little of Bilbo's cloak and trousers are on show. This was definitely inspired by that Michael Hague painting. I just really love the slightly garish colour combinations that give it that medieval look. I then used Avalanche Sunset to paint his sleeves. I painted the little scenic rock Storm Vermin Fir, which is my go-to for rocks as it's a nice browny grey. Next up was Rhinox Hide for Bilbo and Gandalf's belts. God, try saying that 5 times fast. I then used Cadian Flesh Tone for all of the skin. And Stormhost Silver for the swords. Bilbo's hair was painted Talon Sand, and I also tried to give the impression of hairy feet as well, though I'm not sure it's really apparent. I then used White Scar for Gandalf's beard and hair, and I painted Bilbo's belt buckle with Retributor armour. And that's all of the base coat colours done, and so far everything is looking nice and neat, which is great. Now it's time to start adding some washes. I start with Reichland Flesh Shade and cover Bilbo, the thrush and the swords with it. Annoyingly, I only noticed too late the Retributor armour in the previous step wasn't quite dry, and my Reichland Flesh Shade wash takes on a metallic fleck and darkens everything much more than I wanted it to. A rookie mistake, but I was able to fix it later without too much trouble, just by reapplying the base coat colours. Gandalf was then given a wash of Nuln Oil. And here's how it looks after the washes had dried. I then go back and reapply the base coat colours, leaving the wash in the recesses but just trying to undo some of the areas that were dulled down too much by them. After all that was done, I started picking out some areas to highlight. I won't go through all of the steps, as they were often just a little dab or brush stroke here or there. I just pick a lighter colour of a base coat and just try and catch the most prominent areas. I mean, you all know how highlighting works. At this scale it's so quick and easy though. At least it is when painting a character model like this. Painting a strip of infantry is a lot less quick and a lot less fun, but this was really satisfying. The final step was to paint the base with Steel Legion Drab, and after flocking it, it was ready for the tabletop. And with that, the entire contents of the Battle of Five Armies box was done. A project 9 years in the making, albeit with a long hiatus in between. But it just goes to show, just because something is in your pile of shame, it doesn't mean it has to stay there. It feels great to have this initial goal completed, but I'm certainly not done with this project yet. In fact, I have some exciting reinforcements waiting in the wings as we speak. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself, so I think I'll just keep this video focused on the things I just painted. We'll save the big full army reveals and my ongoing plans for the project for the next video. So, with that said, let's set the scene with a few paragraphs from The Hobbit and show off some lovely painted miniatures. Tonight, the Lord of Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot. So he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and circling ever round and round, they came down, down, down towards the ring of wolves, and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. The wolves had caught fire and fled into the forest, and had set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and on this eastern side of the mountains there had been little rain for some time. Yellowing bracken, fallen branches, deep-piled pine needles, and here and there dead trees were soon in flames. All round the clearing of the warg's fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling round the trunks and cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red and fierce as the flames. Then suddenly, goblins came running up yelling. They thought a battle with the woodmen was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and clashed the shafts against their shields. Goblins are not afraid of fire, and they soon had a plan which seemed to them most amusing. Some got all wolves together in a pack. Some stacked fern and brushwood round the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out, but they did not put out the fire nearest the trees where the dwarves were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken. Soon they had a ring of smoke and flame all round the dwarves, a ring which they kept from spreading outwards, but it closed slowly in, till the running fire was licking the fuel piled under the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes. He could feel the heat of the flames, and through the reek he could see the goblins dancing round and round in a circle like people round a midsummer bonfire. Outside the ring of dancing warriors with spears and axes stood the wolves at a respectful distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins beginning a horrible song.
15 birds in 5 fir trees, their feathers were fanned in a fiery breeze. The funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what shall we do with the funny little things? Roast them alive or stew them in a pot, fry them, grill them and eat them hot.
Then they stopped and shouted out,
Fly away, little birds, fly away if you can. Come down, little birds, you will get roasted in your nests. Sing, sing, little bird, why don't you sing?
Go away, little boys, shouted Gandalf in answer. It wasn't bird nesting time. Also naughty little boys that play with fire get punished. He said it to make them angry and to show them he was not frightened of them, though of course he was, wizard though he was. But they took no notice, and they went on singing.
Burn, burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch, a fizzling torch to light the night for our delight. Yay! Bake and toast and fry and roast until beards blaze and eyes glaze, till hair smolds and skins crack, fat melts and bones black, and cinders lie beneath the sky, so dwarfs shall die and light the night for our delight. Yay! Yahaddy-ho, yah-ho!
And with that yo-ho, the flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment it spread to the others, the bark caught fire, and the lower branches cracked. Then Gandalf climbed to the top of the tree. The sudden splendour flashed from his wand like lightning, as he got ready to spring down from on high right among the spears of the goblins. that would have been the end of him, though he would have probably have killed many of them as he came hurtling down like a thunderbolt. But he never leaped. Just at that moment, the Lord of the Eagles swept down from above, seized him in his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried the Lord of the Eagles, to whom Gandalf had now spoken. Back swept the great birds that were with him, and down they came like a huge black shadow. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth, and the goblins yelled and stamped with rage, and flung their heavy spears in the air in vain. Over them swooped the eagles, the dark rush of their beating wings smote them to the floor, or drove them far away. Their talons tore at goblin faces. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarves, who were scrambling up now as far as they ever dared to go. Poor little Bilbo was very nearly left behind again. He just managed to catch hold of Dorry's legs, and Dorry was borne off last of all. And up they went together above the tumult and the burning, Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now far below, the goblins and the wolves were scattering far and wide in the woods. A few eagles were still circling and sweeping above the battleground. The flames about the trees sprang suddenly up above the highest branch. They went up in a crackling fire. There was a sudden flurry of sparks and smoke. Bilbo had escaped, only just in time.